It's all about offensive line appreciation on today's Locked On Falcons.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So if you do not know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. the Jolly Green Giant, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. And I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that goes strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we are continuing our positional reviews of the offense, wrapping up the offense with the offensive line. We'll talk about the case for and against re-signing Drew Dalman. We'll talk about the diversifying the run game, which is a critical part for the Falcons to be a better offense in 2025. But let's start off with appreciation, right? Some of y'all think I'm way too hard, way too critical of this Falcons offensive line, which maybe I am, right? I think this unit definitely took a step forward in 2024 after a down 2023 season. I'm a little less convinced of their growth potential if they don't diversify their run game. More on that later. But I look at this offensive line as a solid unit. I look at them more as a 6 out of 10 in their current state, rather than the sort of 7 or 8 out of 10 that I think they're often billed as. But let's start with some appreciation for once, right? Let's look at 4 out of the 5 starters currently on the Falcons offensive line, and let's appreciate these guys rather than being overly critical. We'll be a little critical, but mostly appreciative. Starting with Jake Matthews, right? Jake Matthews, not the world's greatest run blocker, but I appreciate Jake because he's a 7 out of 10 left tackle. And during his prime, probably from like 2018 through 2022, I would probably say he was an 8 out of 10. But he's still solid even now, even if he's not quite in his prime anymore. He's a reliable pass protector that requires minimal chip help. And now the Falcons did chip probably on Jake's side more this year than they probably did on the previous 5 seasons combined. But, we'll see Jake struggle at times against a bull rusher. That Jared Verse matchup in 2025 is not one we're looking particularly forward to. But outside of those specific matchups, for the most part, Jake is solid. He's been a set it and forget it left tackle for many, many years. And I appreciate him. And I don't take that for granted because I've seen teams that don't have a 7 out of 10 offensive left tackle. And it is not a good time when you have a lesser left tackle. And Jake is still a great athlete at age 33. You get him outside on that crack toss, man. I appreciate what you're doing out there, Jake. And Matthew Bergeron, another player I've given a lot of grief over the years, right? Because he hasn't lived up quite to expectations, right? He was expected to be that kind of bruiser, bouncer on the left side to kind of balance out Jake's shortcomings in the run game, but hasn't quite lived up to that yet. But I do appreciate the growth that Matthew Bergeron showed in year 2, particularly in terms of improving his technique in pass protection. You all know that I'm not necessarily always trusting of PFF grades, but this is one instance where I do think PFF did get it right, where according to their grades, he went from a 35th percentile pass protector as a rookie to an 68th percentile in his year 2. And I think that's reflective on the film. Now, he still has a enormously high run blocking grade. I don't know if I agree with that part of the PFF stuff, but I do love the toughness. I do love the feistiness that he does bring in that arena. And you do see that hockey player mentality that he has coming from Canada in that role. So I do appreciate that. And I certainly appreciate the right side of the offensive line, which is the engine that is, behind the Falcons' rushing success, starting with Kaleb McGary. While he may be limited in pass protection, whether we're looking at speed rushers like TJ Watt or big, long edgers like Jadeveon Clowney, I do appreciate Kaleb McGary for being that bouncer when it comes to the Falcons' run scheme, right? That unlike pretty much everybody else on this Falcons offensive line, Kaleb McGary, there's no debate about whether or not Kaleb McGary can function in a different blocking scheme. Zone, gap, don't matter, right? Kaleb McGary's that bouncer, right? Where you go up to him, you're the club owner, and you say, Kaleb, people are making trouble in my club. Escort them out the building. And Caleb McGarry is like, right on that, boss. And he'll do that. And I appreciate that about Caleb McGarry, right? You learn to appreciate the scenery when you're stuck on an island for a couple of years. You're like, oh, I found a hidden grotto today. Oh, I didn't know this was here, right? I appreciate that about Caleb McGarry. And then you look at the guy next to him, Chris Lindstrom, right? When you get those two guys, double teaming a guy downhill, combo block, driving them 5 yards down the field, it looks great. But the thing I appreciate most about Chris Lindstrom is when it comes to the outside zone scheme, he is that sort of V8 engine when it comes to that run scheme, right? He's been PFF's highest graded guard in the NFL for 3 years in a row. Why? Because he's arguably the best outside zone run blocker in the entire NFL, at least on the interior, right? PFF's grading system definitely gives a significant bump to zone blocking plays, right? And few players in the NFL can execute the reach blocks and the second level cut blocks quite to the same degree that Chris Lindstrom can, right? Zach Bond still having nightmares, months later now, the Philadelphia Eagles linebacker, after all the cut blocks that Chris Lindstrom put on him in that week 2 game, put that man on the ground. He keeps that blade on him, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate Chris Lindstrom, always willing to slice somebody, right? And, you've heard me say for a decade now, when it comes to the outside zone scheme, right, you need the interior of your offensive line, that guard, center, guard. They got to be heat-seeking missiles when it comes to taking out linebackers on the second level to create those cutback lanes for the running back. And Chris Lindstrom's as good as it gets. We call him the Sidewinder. That's how good of a heat-seeking missile it comes. So I definitely appreciate that. And so the reason why I appreciate the offensive line, because, I know what this unit is. I know what it isn't, right? I sit here, I'm in the trenches, guys, watching the trenches more than probably 99.9% of the people listening to this podcast right now. And what this offensive line is a very, very good outside zone run blocking team. They are a capable pass protecting team, by no means elite, right? What they aren't is a unit when it comes to the run game that can throw different pitches. And when it comes to when defenses can get their ears pinned back against this pass protecting unit, they have some issues there. Not all individuals, but collectively, gets in the third and whatever, third and long, and you got some dudes, they can have some struggles there. And so this is a unit that is best when they're able to go forward as opposed to going backwards, and play action is a big part of that. That was something that Arthur Smith was able to hide some of those deficiencies for many years, something that Zach Robinson didn't quite do. So that's what we talk about when there is an it. I understand what they are, right? And part of the issue with being this outside zone unit is that has not helped this team be effective in short yardage, right? When they need to get a yard, they struggle to get it, right? That the Falcons for a long time, when you looked at the stats, were the NFL's worst short yardage team for the last 2 years, right? And short yardage being anytime you run the ball with 2 or less yards to go and you fail to convert. Now, thanks to a late season surge in 2024, they're no longer the worst short yardage team. They're one of the worst, but no longer in dead last, right? They moved from 32 to 29. So we're in a great spot. Now, if you look at the all 4 years that Dwayne Ledford has been here, and they've been predominantly an outside zone team, they've been a predominantly outside zone team since 2015, but been almost exclusively outside zone, it seems like, since Dwayne Ledford's arrival in 2021. When it comes to short yardage, they're 31st in the league during those last 4 years. So we've seen a trend from a lot of brilliant offensive minds in the NFL to start moving away from the outside zone scheme. You've seen that with Kyle Shanahan, who re-brought the outside zone scheme because Alex Gibbs ran it back during the Jim Mora years. But, Sean McVay especially has moved further away from the outside zone scheme since 2018 and that Super Bowl loss where Bill Belichick kind of exposed the limitations of that blocking scheme. And we've seen a general trend elsewhere in the NFL where teams, it seems to be there's an uptick in the effectiveness of gap and power schemes as opposed to outside zone, where it's been a little less efficient in recent years as part of that trend, right? It's part of the trend of defenses getting lighter and faster. The way that you stop outside zone is with penetration. And, defenses are probably better equipped to doing that today with the penny fronts and the 6-1 fronts and all the speed that they bring to the table. But getting lighter and faster makes you a little bit more vulnerable to a more physical downhill run style, right? So we'll talk more about diversifying the run game, but to me, my criticism for the Falcons overall is I think they're behind the trends. This is not a case where they're zigging and zagging and they're getting a competitive advantage. This is a case where I think they're zigging and zagging and they're falling behind everybody else. And so I think this offensive line is a solid unit. I think it's more than capable of getting the Falcons to the playoffs where we desperately want to be. I'm not sure if they're good enough to get you far in the playoffs when you face the higher caliber of defenses and defensive fronts that you typically see in January. You might call this offensive line Kirk Cousins in that regard. So as we know, everything that's terrible that's happened to the Atlanta Falcons stems from Kirk Cousins. So maybe you can understand why I'm a little bit more critical of the Falcons offensive line holding to a higher standard than many others. But we will talk about the one starter that we did not in center Drew Dalman, and we will show appreciation for Drew Dalman and make the case for and against whether or not the Falcons should sign their top impending free agent. So it is playoff time, and I know you guys are looking to make the most out of these final weeks of football action, and PrizePicks is going to help you do that. If you love football and you want a chance to win real money while watching the games, PrizePicks is the place for you. It's the best way to turn your sports opinions into cash with daily fantasy player projections. Just you for the projections. Right? All you got to do is pick more or less on their stat projections, whether we're looking at passing yards, touchdowns, and you can win up to 1,000 times your money. And this weekend is going to be great for you to get started at PrizePicks because you're going to get a free pick. For the NFC Championship game, Jane Daniels only needs one passing yard for you to win one square. So I've been playing all year long. I'm putting, stuff in on touchdowns for like Josh Allen and James Cook and all those guys, Travis Kelce probably as well. That's how easy it is. You don't have to make it super complicated. So download the app today. Use code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, use that code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5. PrizePicks, run your game. So let's give a little appreciation for the Falcons starting center, Drew Dalman. Love his tenacity. He's a good athlete, very good fit in that outside zone scheme. He's not quite on Chris Lindstrom's level, but he is a very reliable heat-seeking missile when it comes to the interior, when it comes to climbing to that second level. He's shown improvement every year that he's been a starter, and that's been the case for the last 3 years. There's ups and downs with Drew Dalman, but that balance of ups versus downs, I feel like it skews more and more each year in terms of the ups versus the downs. Now, the snapping is still an issue, but I do believe it's better today than it was, when he started out, right? Not to the point where it's no longer a non-issue, but it's less of an issue. And I appreciate that about Drew Dalman, right? He is an impending free agent. We discussed during the bye week, about the possibility of whether or not the Falcons should re-sign Drew Dalman, right? There is a case for and against re-signing Drew Dalman. Now, up front, I am for re-signing Drew Dalman rather than against, right? But to me, it's a similar situation that we saw a couple of years ago with Caleb McGarry, where I was at that time against, I was trying to get off that island, Caleb McGarry Island, as we call it here on Locked On Falcons. And the Falcons, decided that they wanted to stay on the island, which, I think was not the wrong decision based off of hindsight. So the case for re-signing Drew Dalman, I think, is the main one is continuity. We know that continuity really matters for the entire offensive line, and especially at the center position. That's kind of at the center, literally, of that sort of continuity. Not to mention, you're breaking in a new starting quarterback in Michael Penix. That center is going to help that guy with protections and blitzes, all those various things that, Michael Penix is not going to master at this stage in his career. He'll probably be more advanced than your typical first-year starter, but all the help he can get. So, do you want to break in a untested center as well as an untested quarterback? I don't think so. So the other favor in re-signing Drew Dalman, besides, all the things that he brings to the field on as a skill level that we talked about earlier, are there better options, right? I've seen a lot of free agent lists come out over the last couple of weeks, days and weeks, and Drew Dalman is consistently the top center, heading to free agency. Now, maybe you could make a case for the Colts center, Ryan Kelly. We won't make that case on today. Go check out Locked On Colts for that. But, outside of maybe Ryan Kelly, if Drew Dalman's the top guy, it's going to make it difficult for you to upgrade that position in free agency if you let Drew Dalman walk, right? Because there's nobody better than him. And then you look at the draft, and I haven't heard great things about this upcoming center class. I was like, oh, well, you'll be able to get a really good center on day 2 or day 3 of the draft. And not to mention, the Falcons don't really have draft picks to be spending on centers and whatnot, right? They have bigger fish to fry on the defensive side of the ball. So, basically, the main case for Drew Dalman is like, why throw a grenade in your offensive line and are you going to get a better option than Drew Dalman? The answer seems to be no in that regard. Now, the case against Drew Dalman is, as good as Drew Dalman is, he may be a little limited in terms of his skill set, right? We know he's an excellent outside zone blocker, but, can he fit in other schemes? I think he can, but, he's not necessarily the greatest fit in other schemes, right? He's undersized. That contributes to why the team struggles in short yardage when they go up against physical D tackles like Derek Brown and Vita Vea that have given them so many problems over the years, right? I feel like Drew Dalman has handled himself much better in recent matchups with those guys than he had at the beginning of his career. But, I think Dalman can do things athletically, right, that makes him more diverse than what the Falcons have asked him to be the last 3 years as a starter in terms of that outside zone scheme. But, if you are going to have Drew Dalman and you're going to pay him premium dollars and he's going to be your starter for multiple years, you are still going to be predominantly an outside zone run team. And if your goal, and we'll talk about this more later, is to move away from that style of rushing, it does make you a little reluctant to commit, guaranteed money on a multi-year contract to Drew Dalman where you're locking yourself in to maintaining that outside zone scheme. That was basically the argument I made during the bye week. Another thing against Drew Dalman is the injuries. He's missed, I believe, 11 games combined in the last 2 years. I think 8 games this past year, 3 games the previous year. You've gotten decent production, as an injury fill-in from Ryan Newsel, so it hasn't broken your team, but, that's about a third of your games over the last 2 years that Drew Dalman has not been available for, right? And it's hard to have that continuity that we were talking about earlier if you're missing those games. And then the third factor is just simply money. We know the Falcons do not have a ton of cap space as of today. Maybe they create more, but we know that there are going to be consequences to the Falcons spending given their current cap situation. And looking at the market, again, my guess, low end market for Drew Dalman is probably like $6 million a year. High end is north of 10 million, 11 million, 12 million possibly. Right. And you look at the contract Tyler Biadasz for Washington signed last offseason, that was about 10 million a year. Right. That deal looks a lot better for Washington, given I think a lot of people questioned it at the time. It's like, is Biadasz worth this type of money? Given that Biadasz, now hindsight tells us that he's currently the second best offensive lineman on that Washington O-line behind Sam Cosmi. But Drew Dalman is not going to be the second best lineman in Atlanta. He's probably going to be the fourth best lineman in Atlanta, depending on where you stack Caleb McGarry. I currently have Caleb McGarry number 3 personally, but, maybe Drew Dalman can make the push to number 3 spot. We'll see. And so do you really want to have your third or fourth offensive lineman making $10 million a year? Do you want to pay 4 offensive linemen over $10 million a year like you've already paid Jake, you've already paid Lindstrom, you've already paid McGarry and whatnot? So again, that's a main reason against keeping Drew Dalman. But again, I want to reiterate, I am for it. My hope is that because of Drew Dalman's, durability issues a couple of years, the Falcons can get maybe a little bit of a hometown discount from Drew Dalman, similar to what they got with Caleb McGarry, a couple off seasons ago, right? You remember that off season where, there was a couple of right tackles that got some premium dollars. Jack Conklin, $15 million a year. Mike McGlinchey, like 17, 18 million dollars a year. And we were like, oh, this is way too much for Caleb McGarry. If that's the market for a right tackle at this point in time, Caleb McGarry is not worth it. That's why, we won it off the island. But he wound up, signing for 11.5, and that was a bargain given relatively market. And so if you could get a similar bargain for Drew Dalman, instead of paying $10 million, maybe that's $7 million, I'd be willing to push it to $8 million. So now once you get north of $8 million a year for Drew Dalman, that's where, you start looking at some of the, the cons of re-signing Drew Dalman rather than the pros of re-signing Drew Dalman. They become a little bit more compelling at that point in time. So we'll see what that, but I'm optimistic that the Falcons won't break the bank for Drew Dalman under Terry Fontenot. They've been pretty good outside of, the big contracts to guys like Lindstrom and AJ Terrell, trying to make those guys the highest paid players at their respective positions. But when it's come to sort of that next tier down of quality starters, but aren't necessarily like elite players, Caleb McGarry, Cordero Patterson a couple of years ago, Younghoe Koo, like they've gotten those guys re-signed on quality deals without necessarily breaking the bank. And I'm hoping Drew Dalman will be another one of those. Kadero Hodge will be another one of those. I think those are the 2 guys that when you look at the Falcons' upcoming impending free agents, those are the 2 guys that are the biggest priority re-signs at this stage. And so I'm not too worried about the Falcons letting Drew Dalman walk, but obviously we'll hear a lot more information about that in the coming month or so. We have I think we're like 6 or 7 weeks away from the start of free agency at this point in time. So that will be a much more pressing, urgent issue once we get to late February, early March. So we'll revisit that if information has changed. So I'm not particularly worried about it. But if the Falcons are successful re-signing Drew Dalman, I do think they're going to have to not lean as much on the outside zone run scheme as they have these last couple of years and try to diversify the run game. We've talked about that a bit over the last couple of months. And so let's discuss it a bit more as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So if your goal is to start the new year strong, or you've already started 2025 strong and you want to keep that thing going, why not head on over to more live events, whether it's sports, comedy, music, theater in 2025, whatever event is near you. Gametime is going to make it easier to get tickets thanks to their new feature called Gametime Picks, where they're going to filter out the fluff and show you only incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Gametime is offering great seats at unbeatable prices. What you see is what you get, because you can toggle the all-in pricing on in the app, and you'll see your total cost up front. Don't have to worry about hidden fees at checkout. And of course, we love the panoramic seat views that are perfect previews to whatever your event you're headed to. So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time. And growing your small business in 2025 comes down to how well you hire. And let's face it, better hires start with better insights. And that's where LinkedIn is going to help you identify the right candidates, giving you the confidence to make the best decisions for your business. It's a game changer when it comes to hiring the right fit. LinkedIn is going to connect you with the best candidates using data that you won't find anywhere else. From the unique skills, interests, and connections that you share, LinkedIn is going to help you find the right person for the job. In fact, 72% of small businesses say LinkedIn has helped them find high quality candidates. Hire smarter this year and find your next great hire on LinkedIn by posting your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. So let's diversify the Falcons run game. And again, talking about NFL trends, it feels like the direction should be, less reliance on outside zone. The analogy I've used when I've talked about the Falcons run game and their reliance on outside zone is like they have one good pitch, right? Like they have a fastball. And, I don't personally think they're Roger Clemens level, and forgive my outdated baseball references when it comes to throwing heat. But the Falcons do have a pretty good fastball. They relied on outside zone for over 50% of their plays this past year, according to FTN Fantasy. That's 2 times higher than the league average. I think, as I said earlier, the further along in the season you get, like in the postseason versus better defenses, I think you're going to have a lot more problems throwing that one pitch at a high level, right? We saw this kind of week 1 when the Falcons played the Steelers, right? They started off that game really effectively running the football, but then Pittsburgh kind of eventually started shutting it down and figured it out. And the Falcons didn't necessarily adjust. And I think the Steelers game is one of several examples where the Falcons kind of got rolling early with the run game. The defense adjusted, and then the Falcons didn't necessarily have a counter at that point. The Washington game at the end of the season was a good sort of bookend to that Steelers game. And so against quality defenses, I think you're going to need a multitude of pitches, right? I feel like that is pretty self-explanatory why that makes sense. The Lions and 49ers, I think, are 2 good examples of teams that run a lot of outside zone. They're number 2 and number 3 behind the Falcons in terms of most outside zone usage this past year, but they can throw other pitches. It's not an over-reliance on that, right? Some team can take that away. They can, go to their curve. They can go to their sinker. They can go to their knuckleball, whatever you want to use for your baseball analogy. And so, I think it helps with those 2 teams because they have, Hall of Famer and Trent Williams for the 49ers, and Penei Sewell seems like he's probably headed in that direction based off of how he started his career. So that does make it easier. Obviously, the Falcons do not have a player of that caliber. They have good offensive linemen, but not a Hall of Famer at this stage, right? Maybe we'll see with Chris Lindstrom. We'll see. I don't know. I don't want to write off Chris Lindstrom quite yet. We'll get there, but it's a little different when you have that tackle. I think is basically the point I'm trying to make. I don't mean to write off Chris Lindstrom. I'm just saying, like, it's a little different when you have a Hall of Fame tackle versus when you have a Hall of Fame guard. If you understand that. But I do think what the Falcons do have, because of how effective they are outside zone, they do have a lot of athleticism up front, and I think they have more than enough athleticism. And when they do occasionally allow those guys to use it on the rare occasions where they diversify their run game this past year, I think those guys have shown the ability that they have the athleticism that if you want to diversify in more gap and power runs that are going to ask those guys to block on the move, and by pulling them and trapping them and all that stuff, they can do it. Chris Lindstrom was a very effective puller when he was at Boston College. I think there's little reason to think that he will be less effective a puller in the pros, right? The same thing goes with Drew Dalman. We've seen sometimes when Arthur Smith would ask Drew Dalman to sort of pull outside and block on the back end, and he was effective in that. I think there was like one play where the Falcons pulled Matthew Bergeron this past year, and he did an effective job in that. We see Jake Matthews and Caden McGarry constantly pulling when they run the crack tosses on the outside, right? And those guys are both very effective. That's been one of their most effective runs, in large part due to those guys' ability to pull and block in space. So, I've used this example before. You go back to 2014, that offseason, the Falcons signed John Asamoah to be their new starting right guard after they were done with the Peter Kahns experience. I liked Asamoah a ton as a player. I didn't love the fit in Atlanta because at that time, the Falcons were a gap team. Asamoah comes from the Chiefs. They ran a lot more zone, but then offensive line coach Mike Tice and Wade Harmon, they adjusted the scheme, right? They knew that rather than asking guys to just sort of, move guys off the ball in terms of that typical downhill gap scheme, they were involved a lot more movement and pulling, and Asamoah, I think, was sort of spearheading that sort of effectiveness. And, that offensive line wasn't great that year, just in my opinion, due to a lot of injuries, but they were much improved over the previous year, where arguably the 2013 Falcons offensive line is the worst offensive line the Falcons have had, at least, since I've been covering the team. But, maybe your mileage varies. So I feel like the Falcons could do something similar in 2025 as what they did in 2024. Learn from the lessons of the past and mix in some new run concepts. They started doing that after the bye week. It was kind of a sprinkling. And so to me, it tells me that they're looking to move in that direction. I want them to move further, right? Like that sprinkling was like, okay, it's like 5 to 8% different. And I'm like, let's quadruple that. Let's make it 20%. Let's make it 25%, in terms of, rather than sprinkling, let's twist off the bottle and just dump that thing out there. You know what I'm saying? So, we talked about this last week when we talked about Zach Robinson, the offensive coordinator's shortcomings, right? With the play action, the run game, and marrying those two things, and I think that's a huge component of the Falcons' success moving forward, right? The argument I made then was that, some of the issues with the play action was because I don't think the Falcons run plays looked like their play action plays. And so it was easier for defenses to figure out what the Falcons were running. It's oversimplification, I think I used in that episode, but it's like figure out your 5 favorite run plays and build some play action concepts off of that. And if you're not building play action concepts off of that, then they shouldn't be one of your top 5 run plays. Right. And so, just to illustrate how important the play action is, crunching the numbers. If you look at the top 15 teams in play action effectiveness this year, 12 of them made the playoffs. The 2 playoff teams that were the exception were the Kansas City Chiefs and the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Chiefs have Mahomes. The Steelers have the Steelers defense. And while we do love Michael Penix here, right? He is the least on Al Gaib, but I don't know if he's going to be on the Mahomes level quite yet. Is basically what I'm at, and certainly nobody thinks the Falcons are going to be tricking people into thinking they have the Steelers defense. So I sit here and I go, like, to me, if the Falcons want to make the playoffs, basically what I'm sitting here saying, they got to be a top 15 play action team. And last year they were basically the worst play action team in the NFL. So there's got to be a lot of growth. And I think diversifying the run game is going to be part of that. Right. So, I think that was a factor in why the Falcons struggled against good defenses the past year, because they couldn't really attack them with play action. Right. So we'll see. So I hope it's clearer now why I'm such a stickler on, talking about the offensive line and diversifying the run game, and been focused so much on it. But we'll wrap up talking about sort of the depth. What do the Falcons do at the depth position? Ryan Newsel, solid backup, should be back next year. I believe he's a restricted free agent, if I'm not mistaken. No reason to let him walk since he's shown himself to be a solid replacement level starter. I think that's kind of the peak of Ryan Newsel at this point in time, right? I know there are some people that, we should let Dalman walk because we can replace him with Ryan Newsel. He gave the Falcons solid performance in those 8 games that he started for the Falcons. And I'm like, yeah, it was solid, but that's not something I want to marry myself to for a full season or multiple seasons right now. Newsel has similar issues as Dalman, questionable snapping, undersized guy. And the main difference between Newsel and Dalman is Newsel is a far less effective blocker in space. When it comes to the second level blocks and all those various things, I don't think he's nearly as effective. And so, could you make the argument, well, he'll give you 50% of what Drew Dalman gives you for maybe 20% or less of the price? Sure. I don't think that's a particularly compelling argument because I don't feel like downgrading by 50% at the center position, right? I feel like Drew Dalman is already like a solid center, but 50% of Drew Dalman is not a solid center. And basically I'm saying that if you went that direction, I would be very confident, 98% chance that you're going into 2026 looking to upgrade that center position. So to me, I don't think there's a lot of upside to swapping out Dalman for Nuzul, but I do think Nuzul was worth bringing back because of how valuable he has been as a depth option for the Falcons. Storm Norton, I think, is also a free agent. He'll be 31 in May. He's been a solid swing tackle for the Falcons the past 2 years. Resign him on a veteran, minimum deal for 1 year. Sure, makes sense to me. But I do feel like the Falcons should be looking towards this year's draft to find a replacement for Storm Norton. And hopefully that guy will be good enough that you can maybe potentially pencil that person in as a option. Again, we'll see. To potentially be the heir apparent to either Jake Matthews or Caleb McGarry at left or right tackle at some point in the future, right? Since 2025 is likely to be one or more, both of those guys' final years in Atlanta, right? Now, I know there are some people that think the Falcons, in order to create cap space, should cut Caleb McGarry. I think they save $14.5 million. Do so. That's very enticing. But at the same time, it's a similar conversation we were talking about Drew Dalman, where it's like, well, if you cut Caleb McGarry, who you're replacing him with? Because if you need a plug and play starting right tackle to protect Michael Penix's blind side, and again, I understand why people are reluctant to be like, ugh, Caleb McGarry protecting Penix's blind side for a whole season. That doesn't fill me with confidence. But you feel better about a rookie doing it? I mean, I'm sure some of you do, but if you're going to do that, you're probably almost certainly going to have to take that guy with your 15th overall pick. And so that means no defense of pick for the first round. So another offensive player. And, from what I hear about this year's draft class, I haven't done a deep dive in it. I've watched some of these guys, but a lot of the top offensive tackles are expected to be guards in the NFL. And so, like, are you getting the quality of tackle at 15 in this year's upcoming draft that you would normally expect in other drafts? So that's something that people need to consider when they think about replacing one of these swing tackles. So again, use a mid-round pick on a tackle, hope that guy develops into a starter, the Dwayne Ledford magic works or something like that. But, trying to find a starter in addition to all the other issues other fish that the Falcons have to fry, especially on defense at that tackle position, doesn't make a ton of sense to me. I would resign Elijah Wilkinson or some other cheap veteran to be the backup guard. We don't fool with Kyle Hinton on this podcast. Javon Gwynn hasn't shown the growth that you want as a backup guard. He was essentially supposed to be your Drew Dalman insurance and hasn't quite lived up to that at this point in time. So, if the Falcons had more draft picks, I'd be all in favor of them using a day 3 pick on a developmental guard or something like that to add some depth, but we'll just have to settle for punting that till 2026. So hopefully, 2025, Matthew Bergeron will figure it all out in year 3. And, we'll have even more appreciation for this Falcons offensive line in 2025. So we'll see on that front. But those are my thoughts on the Falcons offensive line. We'll be back. Your next episode will be, I guess, a Senior Bowl preview. We'll get some word from Jeff Ulbrich on Monday or whatever, but we'll be back probably with sort of the Sunday night episode breaking down who are the guys that I'm focused on heading into the Senior Bowl. So you'll get more in store of that on your next Locked On Falcons. So continue to make us your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and make sure you check out Locked On NFL for your second listen to get you geared up for this weekend's playoff action in the conference championship games, as well as all the biggest stories and headlines around the NFL. It is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.